The small village lay hidden between green hills and quiet rivers, a place where time seemed to move slower than in the noisy cities far away. Life there was simple, marked by the rhythm of harvests, festivals, and the endless gossip of neighbors. Among the people of that village lived a woman named Amina, known to everyone as quiet and plain, the kind of woman no one noticed unless she passed them on the narrow road with a basket of vegetables balanced carefully on her hip. She was widowed young, and though she never complained, the hardships she carried were obvious in the lines of her face and the strength of her arms. People often said she was too simple, a phrase that meant she had no polish, no education, and certainly no grand talents to boast about. But Amina had a stubborn spark inside her, a fire that never showed on her face yet lived in her eyes. She worked her fields alone, tended her small herd of goats and kept to herself, until one day a chance event changed the way everyone looked at her forever. It began when a group of men from the nearby town visited the village, carrying with them old rifles for sport and demonstration. The villagers, curious as always, gathered around the dusty clearing where the men set up clay pots on wooden posts and laughed as they boasted of their shooting skills. For many, it was a rare form of entertainment, something new to break the monotony of everyday life. Children climbed on fences, women peeked from behind their shawls, and old men stroked their beards, nodding with amusement. Amina was among them, standing quietly at the edge, holding her worn scarf against the sun. She had never touched a rifle in her life, though her father long ago had hunted with one before war and poverty took everything from their family. As the men shot at the targets, missing half the time, the crowd laughed and clapped. Pride swelled in the shooters' voices, and soon they turned to the villagers, asking if anyone else dared try. A few young boys attempted, fumbling awkwardly while the men mocked them. Finally, with a strange courage even she could not explain, Amina stepped forward. The laughter began instantly. What would she know about rifles? One man jeered. Another shook his head, smirking. Look how she even holds the basket on her hip. Imagine her with a gun. Amina said nothing. She simply extended her hand, and after a long pause filled with chuckles, one of the men handed her an old rifle, heavy and scratched from years of use. The weight surprised her, but she steadied it against her shoulder, trying to remember the stories her father once told her about balance, breath, and patience. The crowd erupted in laughter again. Her stance looked awkward, her grip uneven, and her simple dress flapped in the wind as though mocking her further. She will break her shoulder before she hits anything, one voice shouted from the back. Even the children giggled. For a moment, Amina felt heat rise in her cheeks, the kind of heat that came from shame, the kind of shame she had lived with all her life in whispers about being ordinary, unremarkable, invisible. But then something shifted. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and remembered her father's calm voice telling her that the secret to any aim was not the strength of the arm but the stillness of the spirit. She raised the rifle again, ignoring the laughter, and aimed at the first clay pot. The crack of the shot echoed across the fields, and the pot shattered into dust. The laughter stopped. She did not lower the rifle. Her hands no longer trembled. Another deep breath, another shot. The second pot shattered. Then the third. The silence of the crowd grew heavier with each explosion of clay. By the 10th shot, children were no longer giggling. They were gaping, wide-eyed, their mouths open in awe. By the 15th, even the men who mocked her stood frozen, their pride collapsing into disbelief. By the 20th, women in the crowd began to smile quietly, their eyes shining with a pride they had not dared to feel before. And by the 25th, when the last clay pot burst into fragments, the clearing was so silent that even the wind seemed to stop moving. Amina lowered the rifle slowly, her face expressionless, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside, her heart raced, but she gave no sign of triumph, no smile of victory. She simply handed the rifle back to the man who had mocked her the loudest, his face pale and lips trembling with words he could not form. The crowd erupted then, not in laughter but in gasps, shouts, and applause. Children rushed to her side, women whispered her name with admiration, and men looked at one another in stunned silence. Amina walked away quietly just as she had arrived, her basket of vegetables still waiting by the fence. She carried it home, the sound of whispers following her down the dusty path, whispers that would not fade for a long time. For the first time in her life, the simple woman had become unforgettable. That night the village did not sleep easily. Fires burned late in the courtyards as families gathered to retell the story again and again, each version slightly more exaggerated than the last, until the woman who had quietly carried vegetables became a legend who split clay pots with the precision of a soldier. The children reenacted her stance, imitating the way she had closed her eyes and breathed before pulling the trigger, and the women whispered with astonishment, wondering how long she had hidden such a gift. The men, especially the ones who had mocked her, remained silent, though in their hearts they carried a strange mix of shame and respect. Amina herself sat alone in her modest house, the walls bare and the floor swept clean, listening to the distant hum of voices outside. She had never asked for recognition, she had not even wanted to prove herself that day. Something deeper had moved her, something like the voice of her father whispering through memory. She lit a small lamp and stared at the flame, her mind caught between pride and fear, because she knew that once a reputation begins to form, it carries with it both power and danger. In the following days the village treated her differently. Where once she was overlooked, now every greeting carried a weight of respect. Old women offered her extra vegetables at the market. Children followed her at a distance, hoping to catch a smile or a word. The men, too proud to apologize directly, nodded stiffly when they passed her, as if acknowledging her in silence was the best they could do. It should have made her happy, but instead she felt restless, uneasy with the attention. She had lived her life trying not to draw eyes upon herself, and now she found herself at the center of every conversation. Worse still, the story began to spread beyond the village. Travelers carried tales of the simple woman sharpshooter to nearby towns, and soon strangers arrived, curious to see her for themselves. Some came with admiration, others with skepticism, but all of them carried questions Amina did not know how to answer. One afternoon, a group of hunters from a distant valley visited. They had heard of her skill and wanted to test her further. They set up moving targets, tossing wooden discs into the air, confident she would fail before their practiced eyes. But Amina, though nervous, found the same stillness inside her as before. She lifted the rifle and one by one, discs shattered in the sky each fall, followed by the silence of disbelief. The hunters bowed their heads, murmuring that she possessed a gift touched by destiny. Word spread faster after that until even the district officials heard of her. It was not long before the local commander of the militia arrived, a stern man in uniform whose eyes missed nothing. He asked to see her shoot, and though Amina hesitated, she obeyed out of respect. When she struck every target he placed before her, the commander's expression remained unreadable, but his words carried a heavy weight. A woman like you should not waste her skill on goats and fields. The country needs eyes like yours. His offer was clear. He wanted her to join them, to become a shooter in service of the militia. The villagers buzzed with excitement at the idea, some proud that their home had produced someone worthy of such honor, others fearful that this meant she would be taken away, never to return. Amina herself was torn. She had no desire for weapons or war, but she also knew the commander's words were not a suggestion but a command dressed in politeness. That night she could not sleep. She walked outside under the stars, the cool air brushing against her skin, and thought of the path before her. She remembered the quiet life she had built, the field she had tended with her own hands, the memory of her husband buried beneath the earth of the same land, and she wondered if leaving it all behind would mean abandoning herself. Yet another voice inside her whispered that fate had chosen her, that her skill was not an accident but a calling, one that could no longer be ignored. She stood in the silence of the fields, listening to the wind move through the tall grass, and in that moment she realized she stood at the edge of a choice that would change her life forever. The following morning the commander returned, expecting her decision. The villagers gathered again, watching nervously as she stepped forward. Amina kept her face calm, her heart racing only within. She did not speak in many words, for she never had the habit of long speeches, but her voice was steady as she said she would serve, not for glory or recognition, but because her father had once told her that every gift comes with a responsibility. The commander nodded, satisfied, and announced that she would begin training with his unit immediately. The villagers cheered, though the sound carried both pride and sorrow. Children cried, women clutched their scarves, and men patted her shoulder as if sending off one of their own sons to battle. Amina packed little, for she owned little. A scarf, a worn shawl, and the memory of her father's words were all she carried as she left the village behind, walking beside the commander toward an unknown future. The road stretched long and uncertain before her, but with each step she felt the weight of her new destiny settling onto her shoulders. She was no longer just the simple woman carrying a basket of vegetables. She was something more now, though what exactly she would become remained a mystery waiting beyond the horizon. The journey to the training camp was long, winding through valleys and rivers, and each mile carried Amina further away from the quiet life she had always known. She walked in silence beside the militia commander, her scarf pulled low to shield her from the dust, while soldiers marched ahead and behind, their boots striking the earth in a rhythm she had never heard before. At first she felt like an outsider, a villager among men hardened by discipline, their eyes sharp, their movements precise. Some of them looked at her with doubt, others with amusement, whispering to one another about the woman who had somehow caught the attention of their commander. But Amina did not flinch at their stares. She had grown used to doubt and laughter all her life, and she knew that the only way to silence it was not with words but with actions. When they arrived at the camp, Amina's senses were overwhelmed. Rows of tents stretched across the dry plain, soldiers trained in circles, rifles cracked in the distance, and horses neighed as they carried supplies from one corner to another. The camp was alive with the energy of men preparing for conflict, though no war had yet reached that valley. She was given a small tent, a bedroll, and a rifle that was newer and heavier than the one she had first used in her village. That night, she sat alone in her tent, listening to the sounds of boots, orders, and laughter outside, and wondered if she had made the right choice. The air smelled of gunpowder and sweat, a reminder that her world had changed forever. Training began the next morning. The commander ordered her to join the other recruits on the range. At first, the men scoffed at her presence, whispering cruel jokes under their breath, but when she lifted her rifle and struck every target placed before her, the laughter faded. Yet the commander was not impressed by talent alone. "Skill without discipline is a loose arrow," he told her, his voice stern. He pushed her harder than the others, demanding perfect stance, perfect breathing, and perfect timing. She spent hours under the blazing sun, her body aching as she repeated drills again and again. At night, when the men collapsed into their tents, Amina stayed behind, practicing in silence, determined not to let her weakness betray her. Slowly the whispers began to change. Where once the soldiers mocked her, they now watched her with curiosity, and then with respect, as she outlasted even the strongest among them in endurance and accuracy. But her struggle was not only physical. Many nights she lay awake, staring at the canvas roof of her tent, her thoughts drifting back to the village she had left behind. She wondered if the children still spoke of her, if the women still whispered her name, if the goats wandered restlessly without her hand to guide them. She missed the quiet rhythm of her fields, the sound of wind in the trees, the smell of bread baking in her small oven. The camp was loud, filled with orders and tension, and though she was becoming stronger each day, she often felt the loneliness of being surrounded by men who did not understand her silence. Still, she endured, telling herself that this path had chosen her, and she could not turn away from it now. One day the commander arranged a challenge, meant to test all recruits in front of the entire camp. Targets were placed at greater distances than anyone had ever practiced before, so far that the line between skill and luck blurred. Each man tried, failing more often than succeeding, their bullets kicking up dust far from the mark. When Amina's turn came, whispers rose in anticipation, some expecting her to fail at last, others eager to see if the stories about her were true. She stood in the scorching sun, lifted her rifle, and closed her eyes briefly to find the calmness inside her. When she opened them, the world seemed sharper, the distance between her and the target shrinking in her mind. Shot after shot cracked through the air, and one after another, the distant marks fell. By the end of her turn, not a single target remained standing. Silence fell across the camp before it broke into thunderous applause and shouts. Even the commander, who rarely revealed emotion, nodded with the faintest hint of approval. From that day forward, Amina was no longer treated as an outsider. The men respected her as one of their own, some even admiring her more than they would admit. She was given the title of marksman, a name that carried weight in the camp, though. She still lived simply, keeping her tent bare and her words few. Yet deep inside she felt the growing pressure of her reputation. Every success made her less free, binding her to expectations she had never sought. The commander began to call on her for demonstrations when visitors arrived, using her skill to impress officials and allies. She became a symbol, and symbols, she realized, carried burdens heavier than any rifle. One evening, after a long day of training, the commander summoned her privately. His eyes were serious, his voice low as he explained that rumors of war were spreading. Enemies across the border had begun to stir, and soon the militia would be called to defend the land. He told her that she would not be just another soldier when that time came, she would lead a small unit, chosen for precision and courage, and her role would be vital. Amina listened in silence, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had left her village as a simple woman, unsure of her place in the world, but now she was being shaped into something she had never imagined. A leader, a warrior, perhaps even a legend. She nodded slowly, accepting the path that lay before her, though inside she wondered what price she would pay for becoming the person everyone now believed her to be. The weeks that followed were filled with an intensity Amina had never known. Training grew harsher, food rations lighter, and the air itself seemed to thicken with the scent of coming conflict. The militia camp was no longer a place of drills and demonstrations. It became a forge where men and women were hammered into weapons. Amina, though still quiet, found herself standing at the center of it all. Soldiers came to her for advice on breathing, on patience, on how to steady their hands when fear threatened to make them tremble. She was surprised to find that she had something to teach, for she had never thought of herself as wise. She repeated the words her father once told her, that calmness is stronger than force, and that the heart must be still if the aim is to be true. The men listened, some skeptical at first, but they could not deny the truth when they saw her fire a rifle with unerring accuracy, no matter the distance, no matter the weather. Yet for all the respect she gained, Amina felt the creeping shadow of dread. War was not a contest of clay pots or wooden discs. War meant blood, screams, and the irreversible act of taking life. She had proven her skill in sport, but what would it mean when the targets were not lifeless objects but breathing men with families of their own? These thoughts troubled her at night, when she lay on her bedroll staring at the dim glow of the lantern. She remembered her husband's face, kind and gentle, and wondered if he would have wanted her to carry a rifle. She remembered the children of her village, their laughter echoing in her ears, and asked herself if she could bear to silence such laughter forever in another land. Still, she knew the choice was no longer hers. The commander's words had been clear. War was coming, and when it did, her place would be at the front. The day of departure arrived sooner than expected. Scouts returned with reports that enemy forces had crossed the border, setting fire to farms and taking livestock. The commander assembled the militia at dawn, his voice hard and commanding as he laid out their mission. They would march to intercept, not only to defend their land but to send a warning that their valley would not fall easily. Amina stood among the ranks, her rifle strapped across her back, her heart pounding as she listened. The men looked at her with trust now, no longer with doubt, and she felt the weight of their belief pressing heavily against her shoulders. She had become a symbol not just to the camp but to every soldier preparing for battle. The march was long and grueling. Dust rose with every step, clinging to faces and clothes, while the sun beat down without mercy. At night they camped under the stars, too weary to speak, each man lost in his own thoughts of the coming fight. Amina walked in silence, her mind drifting between fear and determination. She tried to remember the rhythm of her village, the smell of bread, the sound of goats, the laughter of children, as if holding on to those memories would remind her what she was truly fighting for. More than once she thought of turning back, but each time she looked at the faces around her, hardened by duty, she knew she could not abandon them. She was no longer a simple woman, she was part of something larger, and her fate was bound to theirs. On the fourth day they reached the outskirts of a burned village. Smoke still rose from the ruins and the silence was heavier than death. Charred beams jutted into the sky like broken bones, and the stench of destruction clung to the air. Amina's chest tightened as she walked through the wreckage. She saw toys scattered among the ashes, a broken clay pot lying near a collapsed wall, and she thought of her own home, her own people, and what might happen if they failed. The soldiers around her clenched their fists, their anger sharpening into resolve. The commander ordered them to rest, but few could sleep that night. The reality of war had revealed itself, and there was no turning back. The battle came at dawn. Scouts signaled that enemy forces were approaching through the valley, a column of armed men moving with the arrogance of conquerors. The militia prepared positions along the ridges, rifles ready, breaths shallow. Amina knelt among them, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. She listened to the commander's final orders, her eyes fixed on the horizon where dust clouds announced the enemy's arrival. When the first clash came, it was like thunder, rifles cracking, shouts filling the air, smoke rising in waves. Amina's world narrowed to the sight through her rifle, the line of her breath, the stillness of her hands. Each shot she fired found its mark, enemies falling one after another, and those around her drew strength from her precision. But with every man she struck, a part of her heart grew heavier. She did not cheer, she did not shout, she only pressed on, her face calm, her spirit torn. Hours stretched like days, and the battle raged without pause. The militia held their ground, their determination stronger than the invaders expected. By midday the enemy began to falter, their arrogance crumbling under the relentless defense. Amina never missed, her reputation now solidified not just as legend but as fact. Yet when the last enemy retreated, leaving the valley scarred and silent, she did not feel triumph. She lowered her rifle slowly, her body trembling, not from fear but from the weight of what she had done. Around her, soldiers cheered, embracing one another, crying out in victory. But Amina stood apart, staring at the battlefield strewn with bodies, and felt only the cold reality of her gift. She had protected her land, yes, but she had also crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. That night the camp celebrated, fires burning high, songs echoing into the night sky. Men toasted her name, calling her savior, hero, legend. The commander himself praised her before all, declaring that without her, the valley would have fallen. Amina nodded quietly, accepting their gratitude, but inside she felt no joy. She returned to her tent, sat alone in the darkness, and whispered to herself the words her father once told her. Every gift carries a responsibility. Now she understood the weight of those words more than ever before, and she wondered how much more her gift would demand of her in the days to come. The days after the battle changed the camp in ways Amina could feel in every breath of wind and every glance cast in her direction. The soldiers no longer saw her as a woman among them but as something beyond their measure, a figure who had stood at the line of death and not faltered. When she walked through the rows of tents, men straightened their backs, voices lowered, and eyes followed her with reverence. Some whispered prayers as she passed, as though she were touched by something divine. The commander, though still stern, began to consult her more openly, asking for her thoughts on strategy, on terrain, on the moments when patience might turn the tide. Amina listened, offered her words carefully, and returned to her solitude. For while the others celebrated, she carried the weight of what she had done like a stone pressing against her heart. At night she dreamed of faces she had never seen in life, faces of men she had struck down, their eyes staring at her with questions she could not answer. She awoke with sweat on her brow, staring into the darkness of her tent, telling herself again and again that it had been necessary, that her valley, her people, her very land depended on it. The war did not end with that battle. Scouts returned with news of further incursions, small bands of raiders testing the edges of their defenses. The commander knew these were only shadows of the larger force that lay waiting beyond the hills. Amina was sent out with small groups, tasked with moving silently through forests and cliffs, striking at enemies who believed themselves hidden. These missions required not only accuracy but cunning, and Amina learned quickly how to read the land as if it were a map written for her eyes alone. She guided men through narrow passes, placed them in positions where a single volley could break the enemy's courage, and always her rifle spoke with deadly precision. The soldiers who once doubted her now trusted her instincts more than their own. They began to follow her without hesitation, as though her presence itself was a shield against failure. Yet with each mission, Amina felt her heart harden. She no longer flinched when she pulled the trigger, no longer hesitated when an enemy rose into her sight. The first time had broken her inside, but repetition dulled the edge of her sorrow, shaping her into something colder, something the village woman she once was would never have recognized. She wondered if she was losing herself, if the quiet soul who once walked barefoot through fields of wheat was gone forever. In the moments of silence between missions, she would sit alone, pressing her palms together, trying to remember the warmth of her old life. But war has a way of erasing memories, and slowly her past began to fade, replaced by the endless rhythm of orders, rifles, and fire. One evening after returning from a mission, the commander summoned her to his tent. He studied her for a long time before speaking, his eyes heavy with the burdens of command. "You have become more than a soldier," he said. "The men look to you as they look to no other. They would follow you into fire itself." Amina remained silent, waiting for the weight of his words to fall. He leaned closer, his voice low. "This war will not be won by strength alone. We need precision, patience, and a symbol that the enemy cannot break. That symbol is you." His words pressed against her like chains. She had never asked to be a symbol, never sought to become anything more than the woman she had always been. Yet she knew refusing him was impossible. She nodded slowly, her silence a form of acceptance, and left his tent with the burden of destiny heavier than ever. Her new role came quickly. She was placed in command of a small unit of sharpshooters, men handpicked for their steady aim and discipline. At first they were uneasy, uncertain about taking orders from a woman, but their doubts vanished after the first mission under her lead. She placed them in positions the enemy never anticipated, turned the tide of ambushes with calm precision, and led them out of traps without losing a single man. By the end of their third mission, the men looked at her with the same respect they gave the commander himself. Some whispered that she could see the battlefield as if it were already written, that her eyes missed nothing, that she carried the patience of stone and the speed of lightning. But every success drew more eyes, not just friendly ones. Word of the woman marksman spread beyond the valley, across enemy lines, until even their foes spoke of her with fear. They called her the Shadow, a name that traveled on the wind like a curse, and enemy commanders began to place bounties on her head. Amina knew this meant danger beyond the battlefield. She was no longer a soldier blending into the ranks, she was a target, and every shot she fired painted her name darker into the stories of both sides. Still, she carried on because to stop would mean to betray the trust of those who now followed her. Late one night, after a long day of marching, she sat alone at the edge of the camp, staring into the distant hills where the enemy lay hidden. The moon cast a pale light across the land, and the silence pressed against her ears. She thought again of her village, of the quiet life that seemed like a dream from another world. She wondered if she would ever see it again, if the children still remembered the day she shattered 25 clay pots, if her goats still wandered the fields waiting for her return. A strange ache filled her chest, not of fear or sorrow, but of longing for the simplicity she had lost. She tightened her scarf around her head, whispered her father's words under her breath, and reminded herself that every gift demanded its price. She only wondered how much more she would have to pay before her gift was satisfied. Winter crept into the valley, and with it came a new rhythm of war. Snow covered the ridges where battles had been fought, rivers froze into silence, and the air turned sharp enough to cut through flesh and bone. The militia did not rest. If anything, the cold made them more vigilant, for enemies used the cover of storms to launch sudden attacks. Amina and her unit of sharpshooters became the commander's sharpest blade, sent out into blizzards and darkness to hold ground where others might falter. Wrapped in layers of wool and leather, their breath steaming in the frozen air, they lay for hours on icy ridges, waiting for movement. Amina's eyes never failed, no matter the storm, no matter the night, and her rifle spoke with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. Her men followed without hesitation, enduring the cold because her presence gave them strength. To them she was no longer only a marksman or a leader, she was the anchor that kept them from breaking in the unforgiving winter of war. But even as her reputation grew, Amina felt the creeping isolation of her role. Around fires, soldiers laughed and shared stories of families waiting back home, of loves left behind, of dreams they hoped to return to. Amina listened quietly, but when it came her turn, she had little to say. Her home was a memory now, blurred by distance and silence, and her husband had long been gone to the grave. She had no children waiting, no family to write letters to, only a village that whispered her name like a legend rather than a person. The soldiers respected her, even admired her, but none truly understood her loneliness. At night, when her men slept, she would sit apart, staring into the flames until they blurred into faces she could not forget, the faces of those she had struck down. War made her stronger, but it also hollowed her from within, leaving her with victories that tasted like ashes. The commander saw this change in her, though he spoke little of it. He called her into his tent one night, the wind howling outside, and placed a map before her. His finger traced the lines of valleys and forests until it landed on a distant mountain pass. "This is where the enemy gathers," he said. "Their supplies move through here, guarded but not untouchable. If we can strike it, we will cut them at the root." He looked at her directly, his eyes hard yet filled with unspoken trust. "I want you to lead the strike." Amina studied the map, the distance, the terrain, the risks. It was a mission that could decide the course of the war, but also one that could destroy those who attempted it. She nodded, accepting without hesitation, though inside her chest her heart beat like a drum. Her unit set out 2 days later, carrying only what they could bear, their rifles, their rations, and their will. The journey was brutal. Snow fell in endless sheets, winds whipped against their faces, and the ground itself threatened to swallow their boots. Yet Amina pressed on, guiding them with the patience of stone. She led them through ravines, over frozen rivers, across ridges where one misstep would mean death. Her men followed without question, for they trusted her eyes more than they trusted the sun. By the 5th day they reached the pass. Hidden among jagged rocks, they looked down upon the enemy convoy, a line of wagons heavy with supplies, guarded by soldiers who laughed around fires, believing themselves safe in the heart of winter. Amina lay in the snow, her rifle steady against her shoulder, and gave the signal. The first shot cracked the silence, striking true, and chaos erupted below. Her unit opened fire in perfect unison, their shots falling like lightning. The enemy scrambled, shouting, but every movement was met with precision, every attempt to organize broken apart by her guidance. When the wagons caught fire, the valley glowed red against the snow, the heat rising into the cold air. Her men cheered, their spirits blazing with triumph. They had struck deep, crippling the enemy's lifeline. But Amina did not cheer. She watched the flames consume the supplies, watched men scatter and fall, and felt again that hollow ache inside her. Victory was theirs, yet it did not warm her heart. The return journey was even harder. The storm grew wild, snow rising to their waists, the cold biting into their bones. Several times her men faltered, ready to give in to the exhaustion, but each time Amina's voice pulled them back. She reminded them of the faces waiting in the valley, of the people who would live because they endured. She shared her rations when theirs ran out, gave her own scarf to one whose face had frozen in the wind. She carried their weight as if it were her own, and by sheer force of will, she brought them all back alive. When they returned to camp, frost clinging to their hair, the soldiers greeted them with cheers, their names shouted like heroes. But when her men lifted Amina upon their shoulders, calling her the savior of the valley, she only bowed her head, her eyes shadowed by sorrow. The commander praised her before the entire camp, declaring that the strike had broken the enemy's spine and turned the tide of the war. Songs were sung of her courage, and the name Amina spread even further, across mountains and valleys, carried by both friend and foe. Yet the more her legend grew, the smaller she felt inside. She no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to the stories, to the whispers, to the weight of expectation that bound her tighter than any chain. At night, she sat in her tent, the songs of celebration echoing outside, and she wondered if she had already given away the last pieces of who she truly was. Spring came at last, melting the snow and revealing the scars of winter battles across the valley. The rivers swelled with thaw, carrying broken branches and ash from burned villages, and the hillsides bloomed again with stubborn flowers that refused to surrender to war. Yet for the militia there was no rest. Scouts brought word that the enemy had not been crushed by winter's strike but had instead gathered greater forces beyond the mountains, determined to reclaim what they had lost. The commander prepared the camp for a campaign that would test every ounce of their strength, and at the center of his plans stood Amina. She no longer marched as a recruit or even as a marksman. She marched as a leader, her unit hardened by countless missions, her name whispered in both fear and hope. To her men she was unshakable, but inside her chest grew a silence so heavy she could barely carry it. Each night she thought of the lives she had taken, the weight of her rifle on her hands, the way her village had once been her whole world. That world felt impossibly far now, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. The campaign began with long marches through wet fields and forests, mud sucking at their boots, rain soaking their clothes until they shivered with every step. The enemy advanced in numbers greater than ever before, their banners darkening the horizon like storm clouds. The commander placed Amina's unit on the ridges, where their rifles could strike before the enemy even saw their faces. Again and again she guided her men, her eyes picking out officers, scouts and leaders among the enemy ranks, and with each fallen target, the tide of battle shifted. Soldiers who once might have broken under the enemy's charge held firm because they knew Amina's shots would cut the danger before it reached them. Her name became a battle cry shouted through the smoke, a promise of survival when hope seemed thin. Yet the enemy learned. They began to change their tactics, hiding behind shields, spreading false movements, laying traps designed to lure her unit into danger. More than once Amina felt the sting of nearly being outwitted, only to recover by the narrowest margin. Her men trusted her blindly, but she knew each decision could cost them their lives. The pressure grew, pressing against her chest until even her steady breathing felt like a burden. One evening, after a particularly bloody skirmish, one of her youngest soldiers approached her quietly. His face was pale, his hands shaking, his voice trembling as he asked, "How do you never fear?" Amina looked at him for a long time before answering softly, "I fear every moment. But I let fear sharpen me, not break me." The boy nodded, comforted, yet Amina knew her words were more fragile than they sounded. Fear lived in her bones, but she had learned to bury it deep where no one could see. The battles dragged on for weeks, and the valley became a graveyard of smoke and steel. Amina's unit fought tirelessly, their legend growing with every strike, but losses began to weigh upon them. Though she guided them with unmatched skill, war spares no one forever. 2 of her men fell in an ambush, their bodies carried back under silent skies, and the grief that tore through the unit cut Amina deeper than any wound. She stood with them as they buried the dead, her hands trembling as she laid stones upon the graves. She did not weep, the tears would not come. Instead she felt a hollow ache, the same emptiness that had grown inside her since the first day she pulled the trigger. She wondered how many more she would bury before this war ended, how many names would fade into silence while hers remained carved into memory. The commander noticed her weariness, though he spoke little of it. Instead he gave her greater responsibility, trusting her with missions no other could manage. One such mission came with word that the enemy had gathered their best marksmen to hunt her specifically, men trained to track her shadow and silence the legend. Amina listened calmly as the commander explained, though inside she felt the weight of inevitability. Her name had become too loud, her presence too feared. The enemy would not rest until she was gone. She accepted the mission anyway, leading her men into the forests where their pursuers lurked. What followed was not a battle of armies but a deadly game of patience, silence and unseen eyes. 4 days they stalked each other, shadows moving through trees, rifles waiting in stillness. One by one, Amina outwitted them, striking before they could strike her, her patience deeper than theirs, her calm unshaken. But with each victory she felt herself drifting further from the woman she once was. When they returned, her men praised her brilliance, the commander spoke of her unmatched skill, and the camp celebrated again. Yet Amina sat alone in her tent, staring at her rifle across her lap, feeling as though it had become both her gift and her curse. She thought of the day in her village when she first lifted a weapon, awkward and unsteady, mocked for her simplicity. How far that moment seemed now. She had walked from ridicule into legend, from clay pots into battlefields, and though the world saw her as a hero, she knew she was losing pieces of herself with every step. She whispered again the words her father had told her long ago, "Every gift carries a responsibility." But she could not help but ask in the silence of her heart, what responsibility would this gift demand next, and how much of her soul would it claim before it was satisfied? Summer came, burning away the cold and washing the valley in heat and dust. The war had dragged on longer than anyone expected, draining both sides until even victories felt like wounds. The militia camp was no longer the eager, disciplined force it once had been. It was now hardened, scarred, and weary. Soldiers moved with heavy steps, carrying the weight of battles past, their eyes older than their years. Amina, though still steady with her rifle, felt the same exhaustion deep in her bones. She had fought through snow, storm, and fire, had watched enemies fall and comrades fade, and though her legend grew with every battle, inside she felt herself unraveling. She had become what the world demanded of her, but she wondered if there was anything left of the woman she once was. The commander gathered them one morning with grim news. Scouts reported that the enemy, desperate to turn the tide, was sending their largest force yet into the valley, a final push meant to break the militia once and for all. The battle that awaited them would not be a skirmish, not a strike or an ambush, but a storm that would decide the future of their land. Amina listened in silence, her hands folded before her, her face calm. She saw the fear in the eyes of the soldiers around her, and she knew they would look to her when the fighting began. Her skill had made her a leader, but her legend had made her something more, a symbol of survival itself. She could not falter now, not when so many hearts depended on her strength. They marched to meet the enemy at the edge of the valley where the fields stretched wide and the hills rose like guardians on either side. The land seemed to hold its breath as two armies faced each other, dust rising in clouds, banners whipping in the wind. Amina took her place high on the ridge with her unit, her rifle balanced steady, her eyes scanning the horizon. She could feel the weight of every man and woman in the militia pressing upon her shoulders, and for the first time she did not resist it. She accepted it as part of who she had become. When the signal came, the valley erupted into chaos. Rifles cracked, cannons thundered, shouts split the air. The earth trembled under the clash of steel and fire. Amina's world narrowed once more to her sight, her breath, her stillness. She struck officers, standard-bearers, those who tried to rally the enemy lines. Each shot carried not just precision but purpose, and her men followed her rhythm as if the battlefield itself moved to her command. The fighting raged through the day, the sun blazing above them, sweat and blood mixing in the dust. The militia held their ground with desperate courage, their spirits burning each time Amina's rifle spoke. Yet the enemy came in waves, endless and unyielding, and the valley became a storm of death. Amina's hands ached, her body weary, but she did not falter. She thought of her village, of the children who once laughed at her awkward stance, of the goats she had left behind, of her father's voice reminding her that every gift bore responsibility. She pulled the trigger again and again, each shot a promise that she would not let her people fall. By evening the tide began to shift. The enemy, broken by losses, shaken by the relentless defense, started to retreat. Their banners fell, their shouts turned to cries of panic, and the militia surged forward with the last of their strength. Amina's rifle fell silent as she lowered it at last, her breath ragged, her heart heavy. Around her the valley rang with victory, soldiers cheering, weeping, embracing one another. The commander himself rode forward, raising his sword to the sky, declaring the land safe, the war won. The voices of the militia rose in triumph, their cries echoing across the hills. But Amina did not shout. She stood apart, her eyes sweeping over the battlefield littered with bodies, friend and foe alike. For every victory there was a price, and she felt it pressing against her soul. That night the camp burned with celebration. Fires roared, songs rose into the night, and men told stories of the battle they would carry for the rest of their lives. Amina sat quietly by the flames, her face calm, her rifle resting across her knees. Soldiers came to her one by one, thanking her, praising her, calling her savior, hero, legend. She nodded gently, offering a faint smile, but her heart remained silent. She had done what she must, had carried the weight of her gift to its end, but she knew she would never return to the woman she once had been. War had carved her into something else entirely, something that belonged to the stories more than to herself. When the celebrations faded and the camp grew quiet, Amina walked alone to the edge of the valley. The night was still, the stars sharp against the sky, the air heavy with the scent of smoke. She knelt in the grass, closed her eyes and whispered to her father's memory. She told him she had carried her gift as far as it would go, that she had done her duty, that she had protected the land as he once told her she must. And though her heart was heavy, a strange peace settled over her. She knew the world would remember her as the woman who never missed, the shadow who defended the valley, the simple woman who became legend. But in her own heart she still carried the memory of who she once was, the quiet villager, the widow tending her goats, the woman mocked for holding a rifle wrong. That memory, fragile and distant, was her final victory, for it reminded her that beneath the legend she was still human. The end.